Hi, welcome to another edition of Dan Frequently Asked Questions. We are going to deal with a unique musculoskeletal tear and the concerns the individual has about diving. Keep watching. We got an email from a member asking about them doing an elaborate trip to a wonderful diving location and just prior to the trip injuring their supraspinatus muscle. So it's essentially the muscle right here above the wing of or the scapular bone at your back. And they wanted to know several questions. Firstly, whether it was a good idea to dive. Secondly, whether it would harm them to dive. Thirdly, although they didn't ask, there was the issue of medication that they were still taking in order to control the pain. And fourthly, whether or not decompression illness would be more likely because of the injury. Now I'm going to answer these questions one by one. The first question and the details about the injury are not the main thing. Suffice to say, X-rays and ultrasound indicated a tear in the muscle. The individual received physiotherapy and underwent the conventional treatment and had a significant improvement. However, they still had sufficient pain to need to use a Transact plaster and tramadol medication for pain, and in between miprodol. Now, a couple of things. These are all morphine related medications, which are not only a potential hazard if you go into the Orient and go diving, where it can get you locked up in jail because it's considered a drug, but secondly, it can definitely play a role in interfering with your ability to think underwater and therefore cause nitrogen narcosis to occur at an earlier depth or at a more severe level. So it's very important not only to think about the injury, but also the treatment of the injury. This individual received advice from a doctor who was less familiar with diving medicine and a surgeon. The non-diving doctor gave very sensible advice in as far as, if it hurts, don't do it. Let me break that down into something a bit more manageable. What it means is that each step of the process of going diving, which means handling gear, handling whatever else you need to carry onto the boat, whatever you need to wear on your shoulders, including the BC, now with a cylinder which is significantly heavier and will have an influence on that muscle and the potential pain, and then the process of launching, which may or may not be a quiet launch. It can be a bumpy launch depending on where you're going. And then lastly, the maneuvers that you will be performing during the dive. Last but not least, one always needs to consider the need to be able to react in an emergency. If you essentially have a limb you can't use, you won't be much help to your buddy. In that case, what we recommend is that two able-bodied divers should always dive with someone who has a physical inability, so that if one of them gets into trouble, they have someone who is unincapacitated and it takes the risk out of that situation. The second aspect we mentioned was whether or not the medication was an issue. And that is something that you will need to decide for yourself. But as long as you need to take the medicines that you've listed, you are actually not fit to dive because of the sedating effects of that medication. Thirdly, you are unlikely to cause yourself permanent damage if it doesn't hurt doing what you're doing during the dive. And last but not least, the issue of getting decompression illness more readily. There is no clear-cut evidence that an old or fresh injury necessarily puts you at greater risk for decompression illness, especially if it's a muscle rather than a joint or an area where gas is more likely to accumulate because it's a slow tissue. So decompression illness as such is not really the big concern. What may be a concern is deciding on whether the pain that you might have after a dive is as a result of the injury or as a result of decompression illness. So it's not so much that it will cause decompression illness, but that you may not know whether it is or isn't decompression illness versus the original injury. Now here all I need to say is that your pain area in terms of the injury you've described will be something you can rub with your fingers. So you would literally be able to put your hand on your shoulder and you would feel where the pain is. And that would essentially largely eliminate the chance of it being decompression illness. If it's in another location, or if it is unaffected by movement and you can't touch it and point out exactly where the pain is, then the chances of being decompression illness are higher, but it is still not a specific guarantee. So here is the short answer to your question. Firstly, if you have eliminated any probable reason for you to aggravate your injury through the process and the movements during the preparation, diving, and time after diving, that means you're unlikely to make things worse. Secondly, if you are no longer dependent on medication that is potentially sedating, then that would also take that off the table. And thirdly, that you need to make sure that you understand what is and is not pain associated with the original injury versus decompression illness after diving. With those things in mind, it is probably not unreasonable for you to dive. But take it slow, take it easy, and have two able-bodied divers to assist you at all times, and in the case of an emergency in particular, so that you don't inadvertently have to use your injured muscle in order to get yourself to safety, because that may make the injury worse. I hope that that has helped you make a decision about the sensibility of your diving, and that you will make the right and wise decision. Thank you for reaching out to us and asking these questions. Until next time, safe diving.